How's it?
Chris, how are you?
Good, thanks, Kevin. How you doing? Good to see you again.
Good to see you. We've already gone live, so I'm just going to say welcome, everybody. Welcome to Lunchtime Coaching. My name is Britz. I'm executive coach and international leadership facilitator. And back with us, Christopher Kemp, who's a clinical psychologist. Welcome back to the show, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. Sorry I snuck in here at the last second.
Not a problem. I was just about to message. Chris, so as you know, we've had a number of conversations around mental health, and every Tuesday we look at seeing how, just giving us a nice overview of conversation about it, but also, how do we add value to people out there who are possibly struggling with mental health? And one of the topics that we are wanting to chat about that we sort of prefaced this morning was suicide. Now,
Right.
I know that a lot of the time when that comes up as a topic of discussion, very often people kind of want to shy away from it. But I do think that, bringing it to the forefront and having those conversations and bringing a bit of awareness to that really lends itself to how to do this more effectively and maybe give us more insight on being able to handle it more effectively. So, Chris, the topic is suicide. Don't you want to just tell us about suicide? When do we know when someone is headed in that direction, and sort of what is suicide from your perspective, and how do we pay attention to this?
So I like what you say in terms of people shying away from it, because I think that's probably potentially the biggest issue, is that it's such a loaded subject and such a difficult thing to talk about, but of course such a very real risk and something that we know happens all the time. A lot of people die from suicide every single year, so it's certainly something that warrants attention, but I think it's scary for people to bring up, and quite a drastic thing to say if you're reaching out to someone to say, I've been having sort of suicidal thoughts. From a clinical perspective, in terms of what you were saying, in terms of how we distinguish, or how we rather know that someone might be in that space, is we generally distinguish between what we call like suicidal ideation and suicidal intent. So having suicidal thoughts is quite common in people who are feeling depressed, and it's something that you might find yourself thinking about or considering because it might seem attractive to you. It might seem like life feels so unbearable that the thought of being dead sort of appeals to me in a way, just to end everything and end my suffering. That's not the same as intent, which is sort of like, I've made this decision and I have a plan on how I'm going to execute it. And that is the point at which we get really, really worried, and the primary focus becomes, how do we keep you safe? Of course, when someone has suicidal thoughts, it's a major cause for concern. We would want to get that person help. We'd want to make sure that we're kind of keeping an eye on them, but it's not necessarily like we're going to hospitalize you or something like that. Whereas if you have suicidal intent, that's when we look at drastic interventions like having someone admitted to a hospital or something like that.
Chris, just briefly, you mentioned people who sometimes suffer from depression can have suicidal thoughts. How do we know that I'm actually suicidal in this moment, and how do I know I'm just having a bad day? Like I'm under a lot of pressure, and like, are there quite significant spaces that my brain's going to, or is it quite vague?
I think as soon as you start making plans in your mind, you start to consider how you would do something and start actively taking steps towards that. Suicide often requires some amount of preparation. You do obviously get impulsive suicide attempts, most commonly overdosing on medication, things like that. Those are much less likely to be successful. Sort of a real suicide, not a real suicide attempt, but sort of a suicide attempt that's very likely to succeed often requires some level of planning. I think the moment that you feel like you are wanting to actively take steps towards it is when you need to be really concerned. That being said, if you're having suicidal thoughts and you're not talking to anyone about it, that's absolutely a problem as well, because that's how those thoughts then become intent, right? If you're having suicidal thoughts, it means, hey, you're in a really bad space and you should probably be talking to someone, sharing what you're feeling. I think the difficult part is actually on the other side, because people so often don't talk about it, that I think as friends or family of loved ones who are struggling with depression, I think it's something that's very scary, because you are going to be sitting with that feeling of, well, how do I know if this person is safe? Sorry, Kevin, can you hear me? Sorry, for some reason I lost my sound. I think it's come back. Sorry about that.
There we go.
Sorry.
Not a problem.
You could hear me though.
Yes, I could hear you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Perfect. Sorry, I don't know what happened there.
So I remember when I was going through my 20s, having struggled with depression a lot. Suicide for me was also a conversation that I had playing in the background. But I always, thankfully, kind of spoke myself out of it, or really, I really didn't get to attempting anything like that. But what are the suicide signs that we could pay attention to? Because from being in that perspective, I often know that, like you mentioned, people don't really want to talk about that. They don't want to sort of go to someone and go, I'm actually thinking about killing myself. It's not. I remember I didn't want to have the conversation with people, and because there's so much implication to what that would mean, and very often people kind of keep it to themselves. If I'm incorrect, please correct me. But what are the signs that people are really? Are there signs that people? Because I know that a lot of the time suicide does happen, and people kind of go, he was a very happy person, or she was never mentioned anything that goes, that was troubling to them. Are there signs that people can pay attention to? Is there sort of a way that we can actually pay more attention to helping people?
So I think one thing that's really difficult here, and one thing that I do want to highlight, especially for people who may have experienced this, and like you say, there's that common sort of thing of people going, but he was such a happy person, we didn't see this coming. And I think one thing I want to highlight is that in order to intervene as a loved one, as a support system, at some point that person will have to admit to you what they are planning or what they are feeling. And ultimately that decision is up to them. So you do absolutely get cases where people are suicidal, they have suicidal intent, and they are so committed to that they are not going to tell you, because they know that you will intervene and they actually don't want you to. And I think that's something that's really difficult, because even us working from a psychological or sort of a psychiatric perspective, we still rely on people telling us, hey, I'm feeling suicidal. We aren't mind readers, and we can only help as much as a person allows us to help. So we will absolutely ask, as standard practice, especially if someone is depressed, we will ask, have you been having suicidal thoughts? Where are you at? Do we need to be concerned about you? But ultimately, if that person tells us that they're fine, it can be difficult to kind of know otherwise. And I think especially that's speaking as sort of a mental health professional, especially if you're just a loved one or a friend, I think that guilt can weigh so heavily. And I think it's important to acknowledge here that, yes, it actually does rely on the person at some point telling you exactly what's going on in their mind. That being said, the best thing that you can do is to give that person a space to talk. So if you are worried about them, you can say, hey, I feel like you're not yourself. I feel like you're not in a good space. Do you want to talk about it? What's going on? So you can create the space. It's up to that person to use the space. That's what we often say. And that's true not just of something as drastic as suicide, but even someone who's depressed or going through a difficult time. All you can really do is create the space for them. Which is what we do in therapy as well. And ultimately, it's up to that person to then come forward and use that space that you're providing. In terms of sort of warning signs, absolutely, I think all the same stuff that we would say for depression. Social isolation, sort of a change in behavior, irritability, anything that sort of signals to you, especially if you know this person well, that, hey, something is weird here. Some people do an excellent job of hiding that. They put on a brave front all the time, and you never really know what's going on in their mind. And again, you can't control that or hold yourself responsible for that. But if you do notice something different about their mood, if they seem more irritable, they seem more down, particularly people isolating themselves is kind of a big one. So maybe when you see them, they kind of seem happy and fine, but they used to be social, they used to like going out all the time, and now they never really want to talk, or they don't really answer your calls, or maybe you invite them places and they never really come, and that's going on for a while. Something like that, you can sort of say, hey, I know that you seem fine, but this kind of isn't like you. What's going on? Are you okay? Do you need to talk about it?
Also, Chris, in terms of how do you, is there a space where people, where a friend or a family member or someone who's in your world sort of recognizes, oh no, this person's just looking for attention, but surely, they'll say, oh, I'm suicidal and, I just don't know what to do. When someone does, because I've heard people, say stuff like that when they specifically just are actually looking for attention, and you're kind of going, no, you have to be alert, and you have to pay attention to it. How do you distinguish between that? Or, when someone says that, do we kind of wake up and go, no, actually, if someone's saying or intending that kind of process or that kind of behavior, we have to pay attention every single time?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. I mean, I work, as you know, at a clinic with adolescents. So something we hear there quite a lot is parents saying, like, I don't know if they're just doing this for attention. Usually you're referring to some kind of suicide attempt or some kind of self-harming behavior. And our response is always kind of like, so what? If someone has to go to that extreme to get attention, then they clearly really, really need something from you. They really need that attention. There's something there that's really, really missing. So if anyone is ever unsafe or doing self-destructive or harmful behavior, we need to figure out why that's happening and what in the environment is sort of contributing to that. So it's not removing responsibility to say that, but rather saying, hey, look, clearly they're struggling. Clearly they're not coping with this thing. Clearly they are searching for something or looking for something from you. Let's find a way to give them that, and also let's find a way for them to not seek that in an unhealthy manner. So what we would want is, in the example of a teenager here, we'd want the parents to be able to identify what's going on and what they need, and to try and provide that in as reasonable way as possible. And from the teenager side, we'd want them to be able to communicate their needs in a much more effective way, right? We don't want them to communicate their needs through cutting or suicide attempts or anything like that, but there's a reason that they feel like they're not being heard, and we need to identify what that is. Why do they need to communicate in this extreme way instead of being able to come and say, hey, mom and dad, I'm really not okay? So it's often about identifying where is this communication breakdown. So it's not about assigning blame or figuring out who has to take responsibility, but rather saying, okay, clearly communication's gone wrong here, right? If you're having to go to this level. So where do we kind of meet there? And I believe that's the same with adults. If it's your child, if it's your friend, if it's your romantic partner, if they're having to communicate in that way for attention, then we need to figure out why they can't communicate in a more clear and direct and less destructive manner.
Absolutely. And in terms of the moments that we experience, so as individuals, we experience a lot of loss, maybe, or a big disappointment. Don't you want to just touch on some of those other areas that we should be considering, that people may be not okay when they're currently experiencing stuff like major disappointment or recent loss? Or what are other moments like that people are that you as a professional sort of notice that people are really affecting them in a suicidal way?
Yeah, so I think the big ones that come to mind are probably finances and relationships. I think those are the two huge ones that can lead people to feeling suicidal, where they feel like they're in some kind of financial hole that they can't get out of, or they feel the loss of some kind of relationship, and they feel it so strongly in that moment that it dwarfs everything else and makes everything seem kind of pointless or irrelevant in some way. And that's how we kind of operate as individuals in general, right? If you have an exam or a big meeting or something the next day, that might be the biggest thing in your life until you get a phone call saying, your wife has been in a car accident, and suddenly that thing that was so important now becomes completely irrelevant to you. So our brains obviously emotionally have a way of doing that, where they kind of prioritize things over other things. So I think that's what contributes to that feeling. If something feels so huge and so insurmountable to you, it dwarfs everything else in your life, and everything you'd be giving up by taking your life suddenly starts to seem small in comparison. So it's a big concern that you can be so emotionally overwhelmed in that moment that you could do something impulsive. And that's where you sort of get maybe an impulsive suicide or something like that, suicide attempt, which certainly does happen. So it's important to be able to give yourself some kind of space or some kind of distance from that, or to talk to someone about what you're feeling or what you're going through. Most problems are not insurmountable. Many people who have attempted suicide have later kind of come to regret it, or feel like, I'm glad that it wasn't successful. The way I always phrase it to people, because people will often say, why won't you let me take my life? Which in some ways is a reasonable question. If they're saying, this is my life, I am completely miserable, I would enjoy being dead more than I enjoy being alive, it's cruel of you to want to prevent me from committing suicide, which I've had people say to me many times. My answer to that is that we are not protecting present you, we're protecting future you, the you that maybe does not feel this way, the you that is in kind of a better space, and that's who we're really protecting. Present you, we understand, is miserable and unhappy, and maybe is not living a life that's worth living. But we believe that you can come out of this, especially in the case of depression or any kind of circumstances that you can kind of work through. We believe that there's a future you that you can't see right now, and you don't know exists, and you don't believe exists. That's the person we're protecting. The person who would say, I'm so glad that 5 years ago you prevented me from taking my life. And that's how I kind of try and explain it, because it's important to understand that that person may not be able to see that future person. So it would be wrong of me to try and convince them that life is worth living, because I'm just going to seem like I don't really understand what they're going through. So I can actually say to them, yeah, maybe your life right now actually isn't worth living. And if this way you feel right now was going to be the rest of your life, maybe it would make more sense for you not to live it. But we're not protecting that person. We're protecting the future you. And Kevin, I think you can obviously relate to that, saying that you were in such a dark space then, and where you are now is obviously much better. So this is the future you that we would have been protecting back then when you were really struggling.
I mean, I find it so interesting that you mentioned that, because what's funny about future you, in the moment that you're experiencing the depression and that miserable life-defining moment that you're having, in that moment, you simply don't know what you don't know. And I think that's so key, and it's such a sort of key point. Specifically, if you find yourself in a suicidal space, or if you're having those types of thoughts, is that things change, people change, life changes. Things will change. It's getting stuck in that moment, and I think, and that's I love that you bring it as the attention point, because I think people should know that the future you could really, if I think of what I do today compared to when I was 25 years old, my life is like night and day, so it's a beautiful actual process.
Yeah, and I always say, I think you're so right in that it requires a leap of faith. I ask people to take a leap of faith, or just to trust something that's impossible to trust. The metaphor I use for this is, imagine you were sort of in a tiny little box. It's dark, you can't see anything, it's cramped and miserable, but outside of that box is, I don't know, paradise. And we're all standing outside the box and telling you from the outside, hey, it's great out here. Trust me, it's really cool out here. And all you can see is that box. So it kind of sounds like nonsense. You've never seen that world. You've never experienced that world. So how are you supposed to believe it? Your whole concept is just the inside of this box. And we're telling you to believe in something that you can't conceptualize, can't even imagine, because you've never seen it. So I feel like that's what it's like when you're in that deep depression, and family and psychologists, psychiatrists, anyone's like, trust me, it can get better. We're outside the box. It's quite nice out here. You might like it, Yeah. So yeah, it's really, really hard, because it does require a leap of faith. And that's why I say we are protecting your life, sometimes against your will, because we feel like it can get better, but we also understand that you don't believe that, and that's okay. I don't need someone to believe that. It's okay if that they need to feel what they feel right now, and that's okay. We'd like to get them to a place where they can believe that, but yeah, we can't force anyone to feel how we want them to feel.
So, Chris, the next question, I know it's a very big question, but just from your opinion and maybe from your personal perspective, specifically dealing with adolescents, what do you think? Why do we have such alarming suicide numbers? If you look at the SADAG website and you do some research on this, it's quite alarming how many people, and obviously COVID is not helping anything with anyone, so it's like, why would you say that we are sitting with this because that's it's almost a pandemic that if you look at the world, how many people are actually taking their lives?
Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of conjecture that you can make about this, and maybe a lot of it comes down to opinion. I feel like the suicide rates can largely be linked to we spoke about finances. I think we are going through a very difficult time economically, and I think that exacerbates all other issues. I think your relationship issues, for example, massively impacted by finances. It puts a lot of strain on a marriage or relationship if finances are bad. It's a lot easier to be married and rich and not having to worry about money than it is scraping by and arguing about money and resenting your partner and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, absolutely. I think finance is a huge one. I think a lot of things are just a lot more difficult right now. I think that we're very connected. We're very aware of everything that's going on. And I think that we are constantly inundated with bad news, bad financial forecasts. We're very connected to all the bad, and at the same time we have social media and everything which presents everyone in the best possible light, so it looks like everyone is doing really, really great, when in reality they're kind of not. So I think that combination is quite tough on a lot of people. I think a lot of people would make the argument that we are more isolated in a lot of ways than we have been, well, particularly during the pandemic. But even before that, the sort of digital revolution has made us more connected, but actually at the same time more disconnected. And I think there's sort of a trade-off there. But yeah, I think globally people aren't happy. It's been a bad decade, essentially, or bad, actually, we're longer than a decade now. Sort of the last 20 years or so, I think have been really tough for people. And I think that's... is reflected, because I think everything else in your life just feels so much worse when the economy's bad and relationships are struggling and all that stuff. So yeah, like I say, a lot of conjecture. It's very nebulous and unclear, but for me, I think that's kind of the big stuff.
Chris, in terms of you mentioned social media, and I know that you work at the Adolescent Center, a clinic at least, in Randburg, and from a adolescent perspective, how impactful or how destructive can social media be to adolescents around suicide? I've heard a lot of reports that it really has impact. From your perspective, is that something that's quite alarming, and seen a lot of cyberbullying and cyberspace kind of engagement where people are losing their sense of self, and parents should really be paying attention to that?
Yeah, I think it's so tricky because a lot of parents want to limit social media, they want to limit screen time and all of that, but for these kids growing up, this is actually how they engage now. If you took all social media away from your child, in some ways you might be stunting their social development, because really that's how kids are engaging now to a large extent. So it's sort of this devil that but you can't necessarily remove, because it's baked into their everyday lives, and absolutely is very much so. So I see definitely a lot of that. There's a lot of pressure around that. Very much aesthetic pressure. I feel like a lot of it is based on appearance and selfies and filters and likes, and I think it creates a lot of ambiguity. Online interaction, there's no tone of voice. Someone commented, what does it mean? Someone used this emoji instead of this emoji. What does that mean? And it reminds me, when I grew up, I'm kind of the millennial generation, so I grew up with the internet, but social media was less of a thing in my teen years, and Facebook only really became kind of a big deal kind of when I was just sort of entering university, stuff like that. So Yeah, I didn't have that, and I see it very much now, where there's a huge amount of engagement on that, and I think parents are right to be concerned, and we often don't necessarily have great answers in terms of how to manage it because it is unrestricted. But in the same way that what happens in a school playground is quite unrestricted, what people say to your children, you're often not aware of. So yeah, they get nasty messages on social media the same way they've been bullied on the playground, and it's sort of hard to police, I think, either way, and also something that you can't remove from their lives. So yeah, very tricky. I did my master's thesis on cyberbullying, so it's something I'm quite familiar with. Yeah. So one of the things that did come out of the literature on that is that it's more linked to suicidal ideation or suicide attempts than traditional bullying is. So it definitely seems to be a more emotional kind of bullying, a more manipulative, a more damaging to the kind of self-esteem. And one of the things that is damaging about online bullying is that if it's done in a public place, there's that feeling that everyone is seeing this. So this person called me fat on my Instagram page, and now everyone can see that comment. It's not done on a playground where someone says it, two people see, you feel bad, but it's not this thing that just lingers there and sort of sits with you. So that's one of the ways in which I think it is a lot more damaging. But in terms of how to manage it, very tricky. You know, some parents check their kids' phones, and some parents restrict access, but ultimately it's something that I don't believe you can get away from.
So Chris, I mean, we don't have a lot of time with the lunchtime sessions, but I mean, these topics that we do cover are quite large, and we could speak forever. But, you know, if we're in the situation where someone has attempted suicide, what is the immediate thing for us to do? Like, obviously, you know, if there's injury involved in any way, we're obviously going to phone the ambulances but you know, in that space, maybe 2 or 3 days from that, what are the best ways to handle a situation?
I think absolutely don't be afraid to seek help, and I also want to say don't necessarily rely on the person. You know, in some ways, they've kind of lost the benefit of the doubt, or they've kind of lost your trust. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. I mean that if they are actively suicidal, they can't be trusted to report accurately on whether or not they are suicidal. So if they say, no, I'm fine now, actually everything's great, unfortunately, it's not something that you can trust, and not something that we would trust. Like I said, we rely on kind of self-reporting, but at the same time, we also rely on behavior. So if someone has recently attempted suicide, we have to think of them as suicidal, at least for the foreseeable immediate future. So my advice would be to absolutely get them to maybe a psychologist or someone like that. The psychologist can ask them where they're at. They might be more willing to be honest with a psychologist than with a friend or a parent or something like that. And then you are potentially looking at an admission. So the majority of medical aids will cover a 3-week inpatient admission. So you can go to a facility like an Akeso or something like that, where you can be admitted, and you'll consult with a psychiatrist, you'll consult with psychologists, you'll go for therapy, groups, activities, all kinds of stuff. And the idea would be to get you back on track for when you go out. It's not that everything will be perfect and you'll be fine, but it is sort of to say, okay, you are being managed on medication, you have a therapy process started, this is what we need to do, etc., etc. So yeah, as soon as you get to suicide attempts, that's when you need immediate and swift intervention.
Fantastic. Chris, lastly, if you could give us just 3 pointers on how to be okay. You know, so what am I looking for in my own behavior, or what am I looking for in someone's behavior to just kind of help them and be okay in that situation? Because, you know, a lot of what you're mentioning is communication, or the lack of communication, or destructive communication. What are the pointers you could give us for this topic specifically around suicide?
So I think the big takeaway that I would probably give is to kind of say that as an individual, if you're struggling, it's okay to not be okay. And I think the same as if you're a loved one or someone offering support, allow that person to not be okay. Don't be so freaked out by their potential risks to themselves that you try and disqualify their feelings. That's a trap we can all fall into. We feel scared when a loved one is depressed or a loved one says suicide, the S word. Like if they say they have suicidal thoughts, it can freak us out so much that we kind of want to cancel that. And we want to say, no, you're going to be fine. You'll get through this. You're strong. Allow them to have those thoughts and feelings, allow them to share them with you, and then you can figure out together, hey, what do we need to do here? Are you safe? Are these just thoughts? You want to establish, does this person have a plan, or are they just kind of in a bad way? If they're just in a bad way, then you need to look at therapy or medication or some kind of intervention. Keep checking in with them. If they have a plan, if they confess to you that they've been thinking about it and they think they're going to do this or that, then you need to look at admission immediately. So you can take them to even a general hospital. If you don't know where to go, just go to a regular hospital. They'll set up transfers for you and referrals and all that kind of stuff. If someone is actively suicidal and intends on taking their life and is refusing hospital treatment, you can actually get in touch with the police and say, listen, there's this person, they're suicidal, I think they need to be taken to hospital, and the police will come and fetch them, hopefully calmly and politely, but they'll transfer them to a hospital for you. So don't feel like you can't do anything or that your hands are tied. If you are genuinely concerned that is an option, I would always encourage you to discuss it with that person first, though, and make sure that they know exactly what's kind of going on. For yourself as an individual, again, if you're not feeling okay, recognize that in yourself, reach out. Don't let it get so bad. You are entitled to help. You're entitled to have someone listen. Speak to a friend or family member if you need to. Contact a psychologist or a therapist if you feel like you want to talk some stuff through, and that person can also then help you with, do you need medication? Do you need an admission? How bad are things? So speaking to a psychologist or someone like that can kind of help you assess your own risk as well and how much intervention you might need. They're not going to bundle you into a van and get the white coats to come fetch you, so don't be afraid of that, but they can help you sort of figure out for yourself where are you kind of at. Sorry, that wasn't necessarily condensed into points, but I think that's
I mean it's good advice. I absolutely love it. Chris, if we have to get a hold of you, where do we go? Just share with everybody where we can get hold of you. We wanna maybe touch base.
Sure. No, anyone's welcome to contact me. My email address and phone number, the easiest way to find it is just CC Psychology is the name of my practice. So the letter C twice and then psychology.co.za, or you can punch it into Google. You'll find all my info there. My name's Chris Kemp and I have a practice in Bryanston.
Fantastic. And if anybody really wants some more information about suicide and who to contact, please check out the sadag.org website. It's sadag.org. And this is Lunchtime Coaching. We happen to chat to Chris for a while now, and I love that you that you make the time for us, Chris. Thank you so much. Every Tuesday between 12 and 12:30, we're going to have mental health conversations. Chris, thank you, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, Kevin. I just want to add one last thing before we go. You mentioned SADAG. They do have a 24-hour toll-free suicide hotline. So if you are in a really, really bad space, it's 2 a.m, phone them. There's someone there who can chat to you and can help you find someone in your area that can help or direct you to where you need to go. So, 24 hours, toll-free. Give it a look. If you're really in a bad spot, phone the SADAG hotline. And even if you just want to find someone in your area, they can do referrals as well. You don't have to be suicidal. So, check it out. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Chris. And we will see you next week.
Perfect. See you then. Thanks, Kevin.
Cheers, man. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers, man. Bye-bye.